Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra and Joseph Addington. Today we'll be talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill. That's the budget mega bill that Trump wants Congress to pass by Independence Day. The Senate passed the bill through reconciliation yesterday, thanks to a tie breaking vote from Vice President J.D. Vance. We're recording on July 2nd, obviously, a little after 1:30 p.m. So that bill's now in the House, and we'll discuss the politics surrounding the bill and its economic, fiscal implications. But I actually want to start with a discussion of the recent Glastonbury Music Festival, where the British punk rap duo Bob Vylan stirred controversy by chanting "Death, Death to the IDF," referring to the Israel Defense Forces, that's the Israeli military. Now, Bob Vylan also performed their hit song, "I Heard You Want Your Country Back," a reference to the right wing populist slogan about taking back your country. And the chorus goes like this. I'm going to censor the profanity, but you'll get the idea. I heard you want your country back. Shut the F up. I heard you want your country back. You can't have that. I heard you want your country back. Shut the F up. I heard you want your country back. Well, me too. That brilliant lyricism is not what caused the controversy, though. What scandalized governments and the media, and what the US State Department revoked Bob Vylan's visa over so that they can't tour in America, what Bob Vylan's, I think, Hollywood based talent agency dumped the group over, what the British government is investigating as a criminal offense, was the anti IDF chant that I quoted earlier. Samantra, you're the one who suggested we discuss the whole Glastonbury Music Festival, and I was very glad you did so, although I don't know what your take is on it. But what did you want to say?
Oh man. First of all, this guy, for the first time, I'm actually hearing how to pronounce his surname. Up until yesterday, I had no idea how to even pronounce that. So if his surname is
Well, it's
genuinely
just a
pronounced
play
as
on Bob Dylan. The group is Bob Vylan. It's just like a play on Bob Dylan, and he goes by Bobby Vylan as his stage name. But his real name has been doxed by this point, but it's not his real name.
right, I mean, if it genuinely sounds like villain, like I was originally thought like it sounds like villain, like villainy, and I was like, well, that is a case of nominative determinism right there. Um, I first of
Well, I
all,
think it's an intentional play on words there.
right. Apparently the dude is a vegan. Like that's I mean, first of all, I had no idea that there's a thing called punk rap. That's I mean, clearly I'm not in with the crowd. But this guy went on to Glastonbury. For those who are uninitiated of what Glastonbury looks like, it looks like a mix of crowd who would go to a Fleetwood Mac concert who are suddenly dumped onto a a, a Daft Punk kind of situation. So it's a very up middle class. Part of the reason these people are there is because they have a ridiculous amount of money. But they don't really get to live the life of pros, and this is their way of kind of living in the mud. It's I mean, if I was a different kind of academic, I would have spent like a lot of my time in kind of like psychoanalyzing what pushes people to do this thing. Like, why on earth would I leave, a European summer without AC to go and live in the mud? But clearly, I'm not a psychologist, so I've got no answer to that question. This guy, as you mentioned, has profound lyrics. If you want your country back, whatever the rest of the thing is. But that wasn't the cause of the controversy. Clearly not, because the target audience of Glastonbury, are primarily white, but almost 100% upmarket, upper class British, upper middle class British people. They are the ruling class of the country. They don't feel any kind of threat, or they don't feel offended by this guy. It's almost like a minstrel show where you get to find people to come and perform in front of you. You're throwing money, and it's the jester's idea of when a king pays money to have someone, a fool, to come to the court and make fun of himself. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, everyone knows who has got the power. I mean, this is one of the things which, even in the Zoran Mamdani case in New York, and the same case in Glastonbury, like this, it makes me somewhat frustrated to see that people say that, oh, this is just a classic sign of third worldism. In, no, it's not. It's not. If you see the support of Zoran Mamdani in New York, or the kind of crowd that goes to Glastonbury to listen to this guy, this is not third worldism. It's the exact opposite. It is performative. It is extremely masterful in a way. The second thing, which you mentioned, the controversy grows from this guy saying that death to the IDF. This vegan guy who clearly, play acts as someone who's like a rebel, a punk. Um, he said something, and if you know your Orwell, you'd realize that there is this tendency among, especially among Anglo America, like the English speaking countries, to have this idea called vicarious nationalism. You get to relieve your nationalism, but you can't obviously display your flag because that's kind of declasse. So you kind of like do that on behalf of someone else. Like you go through Richmond and walk around in the Monument Avenue, you'd see a lot of Palestinian flags or Ukrainian flags or Israeli flags, but not a single American flag, because in that society, again, in the rich upper class, upper middle class society that we are talking about, performative nationalism of your own country is looked down upon. But that instinct needs to come out somewhere, and it comes out through vicariously living for someone else's nationalism. It's very prominent, especially in the English speaking countries. Part of the reason is they were never really conquered, throughout the age of modernity. But I don't know. I think that's one of the reasons. The second thing is obviously criticism of Israel was controversial in Glastonbury, but criticism of genuine, normal, poor, ethnic white Brits, or just any British people who live within the territory but were poor, is not controversial. You would see that nationalism is rising in the United Kingdom. Similar to the United States, it's kind of like a coalition. There are a lot of working class Brits who are of various racial and ethnic backgrounds, but who are essentially fundamentally products of the empire. They live in Britain. They feel good about Britain. They care about their country. They're offended and worried about mass migration. They're worried about their jobs. They're worried about their culture slowly declining in front of them. They're worried about law and order. But that is not the crowd of Glastonbury, and the Glastonbury crowd kind of looks down upon them. Just like out here, you have the liberal internationalists. To them, people who are nationalistic inside their own country are the chief villains. But on the other hand, the IDF thing, given the circumstances, clearly was enough to get this guy's visa revoked, which I guess in some way explains like just who are given more privilege in political decisions in both of these countries.
Yeah, you said some interesting things. I like your point about vicarious nationalism. I think that's expressed both in pro-Israel and anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, protests and movements. And then also the last thing that you said was quite interesting to me. I do think of politics in Western countries as being in some ways a kind of cold civil war between the different classes of the white population. Um, and so I think there's a little bit of that going on here with the Glastonbury Film, Festival attendees representing, maybe a bit more upper crust. I do think this Bob Vylan, I'd be willing more to defend their punk bona fides and seeing them as kind of within the British punk tradition of like the Sex Pistols and the Clash. Even the way the guy talks in interviews, he kind of sounds like that. Um, and but I can get to that later. Joseph, what do you want to add on this?
Sure, I have no appreciation or knowledge of this kind of music whatsoever, so I will hold off on that
Joseph, you look like the
commentary.
kind of guy who listens to punk. So
Oh yeah, hard metal rocker all day long. Um, So I think that it is really interesting to see this as kind of a civil war. I think there's a few different sides represented here. Glastonbury is largely made up of the British upper classes. And so it's interesting in that in Bob Vylan, essentially, you have the British upper classes bringing in, uh, you know, essentially, I don't think Bob Vylan himself was born in England, but I think his father is an immigrant, and so a second generation immigrant to punch down, as it were, on the white British lower class, and so in essence, he's sort of a proxy target. The the British elite upper class go isn't directly and publicly going to punch down on the British lower class in this sort of very derogatory fashion. Um, Although among themselves they do it all the time. But, this is a way essentially of expressing that kind of class resentment that I think is very pronounced in Britain, and that I think we are seeing more of in the United States as we get this a more polarized by white classes between what's looking to be now the Democratic Party, which represents the white professional middle class and educated upper class, and a more working class Republican Party. You're starting to see some of these exact same sort of cleavages play out, as you mentioned with Zoran Mandani, for example, who is not a Sharia third worldist. What he actually is he is a perfectly assimilated into the PMC theater kid upper class, performing you know the a very standard anti-white, anti-America line, with the added bonus of, having the appropriate skin color to make him aesthetically pleasing for that kind of sensibility.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys both mentioned the Mamdani comparison because I think there's a similarity between the two controversies, which is that conservatives and the right generally, and maybe even just kind of mainstream culture, like including centrists and independents, are looking at these two controversies and focusing entirely on. And by the way, I should say that I think in the case of Mamdani, the controversy is totally manufactured. Although in the Bob Vylan case, I can kind of see why people just sort of naturally had this, negative response to what he said. But people are focusing on the Israel element to the exclusion of things that I think conservatives should be more concerned about. Like in the case of Mamdani, the controversy that was that he was insufficiently supportive of Israel. Like during a debate, when asked what country he would go to first, he didn't say Israel. That's about all the evidence I've seen that the guy's anti-Semitic. I don't think he is anti-Semitic. I understand that there, you know, are elements of anti-Semitism involved in these kind of left-wing pro-Palestinian movements that he's been a part of. But in the case of him in particular, I think it's totally inappropriate to make that accusation against him. And what people should have been focusing on, what conservatives should have been focusing on in his case, is that the guy is like opposed to law enforcement. Like he wants to replace police with like social workers, right? He wants to make it basically more difficult to prosecute people on the subway when they like attack the subway workers. Like that's the thing that's
Abolishing the
annoying about
police
him.
is queer liberation.
Right. Yeah, and as you said, like that is comprehensible within a different ideological frame than like Sharia third worldism. And as far as Bob Vylan, first of all, this death to the IDF chant, I would say even that is not anti-Semitic. And he clarified what seemed obvious to me in a post. He was very defiant in his post. He's basically like, I said what I said and I don't regret it. But he did clarify, I'm not calling for the death or for anyone to go hurt Jews or even IDF soldiers. He was calling for the dismantlement of the Israeli military as an institution. That's what he said, and that's what it seemed like to me. I was much more perturbed by the quote that I read earlier. Um, and a lot of people's on like some of the spicier right wingers on Twitter, kind of like white nationalist adjacent sort of commentators, see him on the stage shouting this, chanting this whatever, like "f you for wanting your country back." They think he's directing it against the audience. I agree with you guys. That's not so clear to me, even though the audience is almost homogeneously white. It's directed against this more lower class seeming, right populist, like Nigel Farage voting kind of white person, right? There is a racial element, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. This guy is a little bit more complicated than people realize. I've been listening to some of his songs just because I if I'm gonna talk about him, I kinda wanna, like, see what he's all about. He sings often about his white mother and how much he loves her. He actually seems to be appreciative of, like, the political freedoms afforded in Great Britain, but he whinges a lot about anti-black racism, um, and he clearly is motivated by some kind of anti-white resentment in that regard, but his fan base is hugely white, and if you look at him in shows, he's got, white fans that love him, and he, like, loves them back. The story's a little bit more complicated, and the last thing I'll say is, as a free speech matter, I'm not a free speech absolutist. Like, I think I'd be supportive of, like, banning pornography, for example, and in our context, that's considered, free speech absolutism entails, not wanting to do that. But I am basically a free speech absolutist when it comes to political speech, which is the kind of speech that our founders of this great country actually wanted to protect. And to me, this seems what he said about the IDF, and even what he said that I disagree with strongly about this "Take Your Country Back" slogan. It's obviously political speech. There's a history in Western music of using lyrics to make political messages that are intended to shock and provoke the audience and the mainstream culture in general. Britain doesn't have as strong of a free speech legacy and institutions as America does. So they're investigating this as a criminal offense. He could go to jail for this. He could be fined. That would be much harder to do in America. The US did revoke his visa. They have every right to do that, I guess. My wife's grandmother recently had her visa application denied to come watch our kid for a couple months. So if that can happen, I'm not going to cry any tears over Bob Vylan being denied entry. But the response to this episode in general, I think, probably does undermine free speech, and in this annoying way where people aren't even focusing on the thing that actually is most concerning, I think, from a right-wing conservative perspective. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add. Sumatra, looks like maybe you do, and then we can move on to the big beautiful bill.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Joseph just mentioned recently. Like, look, the both Mamdani and Villain are classic examples of assimilation. They just assimilated to the current norms of the countries that they live and they have, lived under. This is what they have been taught. Villain has a white mother. I just recently heard that. I literally have no idea about this guy, but that makes a lot of sense. Like in a couple of minutes back when I said that, like, he's a vegan, for anyone who knows anything about Britain, you would understand like what social strata and economic background you would be if you're a vegan in South England. That that explains a lot. It's this guy goes to like I don't know how to give an American example. He's a Whole Foods kind of guy, so he's upper middle class. Quite clearly, he's performing. This is all an act, and I mean, he's not. This guy's not Franz Fanon. He's not. He's acting that type. And the same goes for Mamdani, which you mentioned, Andrew, is another case. Like this idea, all of these policies. First of all, I'd be much more concerned about Mamdani's policies on law and order, as you rightly mentioned, because that is going to, if you genuinely care about working class people, taking police away from the subways are going to harm them a lot more. It's not going to harm the people who are actually supportive of Mamdani, by the way. It's not going to harm anyone who lives in Manhattan. It would harm people who go and use the subways a lot more. So, but again, that makes a lot of sense. If you genuinely see, this is why it frustrates me so much. Like when there's this tendency among a certain section of the right wing to look at any political positioning as a binary between first world and third world, but that is not the case. Like historically, that has never been the case. Like most of the Mamdani is the son of Mira Nair. Like if you know his background, like you would understand. If you think like this guy eats with his hand, then I have got a bridge to sell. Like he doesn't. Like it's quite clearly an act. It's just like it's the Oriental idea of the other exotic, as Edward Said would have mentioned. Um, this guy
Can I interrupt
doesn't.
and ask you a question?
Yes,
Because one,
absolutely.
one, I just want to interrupt and get your response because I have known like second generation, like sons and daughters of immigrants, people non-white immigrants who seemingly become less assimilated to American culture than their parents were. Like, their parents made an
Yeah,
effort to assimilate into American culture, put an American flag outside the front door,
yeah.
eat American food,
Many
try
such
to
cases.
master the dialect, and then their kids will kind of revert to this, more ancestral culture and genuinely identify with it. Like, it might be an act in some way, as you're saying, but it also is like it's more like a conscious, deliberate effort to identify with and assimilate with this culture that they feel is lost because they do feel alienated from the society that they're in. What do you think about that?
It's I think it's a bit more like I personally am a second generation guy, like not in this country, but like in general. But um, first of all, a couple of things. One, the education system in both the United Kingdom and the United States don't do any favor in any kind of assimilation. But by the way, like there's the bunch of self-loathing that is there in the junior higher education system is just off the charts. Like I have been part of the academia. I used to teach at a university, and I like the kind of stuff that they actually teach you is just unbelievable. No wonder like a whole bunch of second generation people who are growing up absolutely hate the place that they live. Second point, part of that is also a natural rebellion against their parents. Their parents, the first generation people, actually fled to make their life better because they have seen firsthand what the other parts of the world are. The second generation people, they have not. They have grown up in relative prosperity, not, a native born, but like better than most of the people around, and they kind of like fetishize the idea that this other, the noble savage, who are living in various different parts of the world. So that is part of the thing. And the third thing is, like as you mentioned rightly, the assimilation is a two-way street. It's you can either blame one side for not being too welcoming of to the second generation kids, or you can blame the second generation kids for not being grateful enough. But at the end of the day, it takes an effort from both of the sides to kind of like be in a place which, like as Teddy Roosevelt once said, like you have to have a state measure where people are only speaking English and nothing else, no other language. Like that is the one. The way to have a republican citizenry is to have a common language. If you can't even understand the other person, you go to Minnesota, and there are places where people don't even speak English. Like it's just they just speak Somali, Somalian languages. That is not something through which you have an assimilation. Like that needs to be some kind of state mandated stuff. Flags, you can't. Obviously, freedom of speech kind of harm. Is a principle where you can actually do anything and the state won't be able to stop you. But there needs to be at least some sort of a state measure where, if not outright ban, waving a foreign flag, any foreign flag on the soil of the United States, should be looked down upon as a taboo. So those are the kind of things that is a both way street, I guess, in my opinion. But to go back to the original point, Mamdani's performative anti-Americanism is essentially performative. Like when I look at the guy, all I see is a soulless, hollow creature who take the shape of anything to win power, and that to me is a far more danger. You cannot trust this guy because he's going to say exactly what he needs to say. He has grown up in an upper class society. His mother is one of the top directors whose movie had Denzel Washington starring. This is clearly not kind of like a third worldist slob. He's whatever he's doing to gain power.
Yeah, she was offered the chance to direct Harry Potter, one of the Harry Potters, and Zoran encouraged her not to. Because I guess they weren't hurting for money. She directed some small art house film instead.
I mean, I
Yeah,
kind of
just
like him now, but like Harry Potter is awful. But anyway,
I think it's important to recognize that, you know, there are kind of two different sources for this. You bring up something that's really important, which is sort of the second generation, the question of assimilation further down in generations. A lot of what happens is essentially, you know, second generation immigrants grow up, and they grow up in a society, and their parents have tried to assimilate and they have an appreciation for it. But what second generation immigrants recognize is that there actually is a separation between themselves and the native population. And so a lot of times they have assimilated to the norms and the expectations of society. What they don't assimilate to is they don't adopt essentially the nation, the rest of the nation as their in group. They don't view the interests of the rest of the population as their own interests. They identify their interests instead with the interests of their native ethnic group. And this is very common, and it's not something that can be easily solved, especially when your ethnic groups are obviously very, you know, uh, are identifiably dissimilar. Like if you are a black man in England with a mostly white population, it's very easy to feel alienated. And what this has done is this has created, as society has globalized, a very easy avenue for ethnic balkanization, which is being promoted essentially by elite classes, which are largely oikophobic, as Roger Scruton talked about this idea of oikophobia, where a lot of white, especially in Anglophone countries, the elite class is largely self-hating, both of its own race and ethnicity, but of its own nation and its own culture. And so it essentially takes advantage of this pathway towards ethnic balkanization in a country to soothe its own cultural pathology. And what this does is it creates the the situation in which you have a great capacity for civil unrest, as you are increasingly seeing in England and in Europe.
I have one thing to add to that. It is a lot easy to assimilate in the United States than it is to assimilate in the United Kingdom. The United States is a republic. There are basic norms which you can follow, which are it's a stable country. And fundamentally, if you live, if you're born within the boundaries of the United States, you can be called an American. Whereas in the United Kingdom, it gets a little bit more complicated. You can be a black British who is playing for England's soccer team, but you're not an Englishman. Sorry, you can be an Englishman because you are born within the boundaries of England, but you're not an Anglo. Like there are a lot more basic differences when it comes to stuff, which given the history of United Kingdom, given the history of the British Empire, it's a lot easier to call yourself a British, whether regardless of where you're born throughout the world during the imperial times or your parents were born, than it is to call yourself a Scotsman or an Englishman. Again, for the Frenchman, it's again different. Like if you're the France has a law, for example, if you bleed for the cause of France, you are a Frenchman. So if you are in the French Foreign Legion and if you join the French Foreign Legion and die, or like you bleed in the battlefield, you're considered Frenchman by blood. None of that, because republics are easy. Like republics are by definition, as a polity, more assimilationist compared to kingdoms or empires in a previous era. So I think that is a difference. I have something. I've got a question for Joseph. You mentioned that the in-group out-group thing. I don't know how that works for people who are, for example, mixed race. Like Barack Obama is half black and half white, but he always identified with one side or the other. So I don't know how that, even though he actually grew up in in with his grandparents from his mother's side. So I don't know how that works for the people who are basically mixed race. Like where do their political consciousness comes into being anyway?
I mean, it obviously depends on the person, but I think empirically we can see it generally falls on the side of uh, whatever race is historically seen as the victim. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think first of all, just culturally in modern Anglo culture, modern American and in modern Britain, then victimhood is is considered, you know, something an important characteristic that allows one to have some kind of self-worth. So in one sense, that's an attractive aspect for somebody who's looking for an identity, who's confused, being able to say, "Oh, I was victimized, and I can identify with this victim group." That often gives people a sense of meaning that they may feel is lacking otherwise. But also, as we see in the case of Zoran Mamdani, it's in many cases a path to power because victimhood gives you a claim on authority. I was victimized. My people are the victims of some kind of injustice, and therefore you should listen to me because I can say how we should change society to solve this injustice.
Barack Obama is an interesting case because although it's true that he identified much more with his black side than his white side, which is not unusual because in America, if you're mixed race, black and white, you're often seen as being black, and you kind of naturally identify as being black. But Obama also presented himself. He kind of leaned into this mixed race thing to kind of present himself as this cosmopolitan embodiment of America's mixed racial character as a nation. I want before we move on to the big beautiful bill, I want to take a shot at Charlie Kirk, who's been kind of annoying me lately. Because and what I would want to say is, I think that the main root issue here is the velocity of demographic transformation in the Western world, which has been unprecedented. Western countries are not the only, multiracial countries, but the speed at which they have voluntarily become so diverse through their immigration policies is, I think, unprecedented in human history. And Charlie Kirk didn't object to that. He used to talk about stapling green cards to diplomas, like this kind of thing. Like he was all about we need more legal immigration. We just can't have illegal immigration. And now he's leaning into this like anti-third world rhetoric and mocking Mamdani for eating rice with his hands, which I agree with you, Sumantra, was kind of a performative act. And I'm just confused, like, about Kirk, like, what did you expect? Like, you wanted you wanted to bring a bunch of people in, including non-European, non-white immigrants, and then now that they're here, you're, like, mad at them for it? Like, it's kinda backwards, It seems like the if you're able to think a step ahead, you would have done the opposite and said, "Well, I want to stop all this rapid immigration, give the culture time to kind of adapt to this demographic transformation, and in the meantime, be respectful toward people who came from outside of the West." I find that whole shtick super annoying, and I do think, as I said, that the issue we're basically dealing with is this demographic transformation, and it should be treated seriously, with open eyes, directly, but also with civility. I would hope. That's my view anyway. But let's talk about the big beautiful bill. President Trump seems to think his second term hinges on getting this thing passed. And by the way, I don't think it's actually officially called the Big Beautiful Bill anymore because Chuck Schumer got the title struck like at the 11th hour. I don't know what the new name is, but that's what everyone's still calling it. The bill will fund Trump's policy agenda. He says he wants to sign it into law by the 4th of July, although he's expressed some, leeway on the deadline. To give a sense of how Trump and Republicans in Congress are thinking about the bill and what it achieves, I'll just read a statement released by the House Republican leadership. Quote, Republicans were elected to do exactly what this bill achieves: secure the border, make tax cuts permanent, unleash American energy dominance, restore peace through strength, cut wasteful spending, and return to a government that puts Americans first. This bill is President Trump's agenda, and we are making it law. End quote. Not mentioned there is that the bill increases the debt or the cumulative deficits by 2034 by over $3 trillion. And that's a low estimate compared to what some estimates show. The one I mentioned is from the Congressional Budget Office. Joseph, what are your thoughts on the substance of this bill, and do you hope it gets signed into law?
Yeah, I mean, the bill is messy. There's no doubt about that. There are a lot of things there that are frankly unjustifiable, like there is no reason that Republicans should be raising the SALT tax. That is a baffling political decision. The people who are going to benefit are Californians and New Yorkers. Because it benefits the residents of states that have very high state taxes. Why are Republicans aiding and abetting this? Because you pay high taxes to California and New York for your state, uh, there's no reason that you should pay less in federal taxes. It's absurd. Um, the debt of the question of the debt is always ugly. Elon Musk has been making a huge deal over this, and the deficit is a huge problem, um, and it does significantly increase the deficit. So those are both probably big points against the bill, the major points against the bill. Major points for the bill, the biggest point for the bill is that it massively increases the funding available for immigration enforcement, which is extremely important. It adds about $150 billion, sorry, to immigration and customs and border patrol budgets, allowing them to build a lot more detention centers, funding the recruitment of many more agents, and also adding the capacity for many more immigration judges in order to be able to get the hearings necessary for deportations completed. And that's probably the most important question because, just under the Biden administration alone, probably about 8 million illegal immigrants entered the United States. If we can get to 1 million deportations every year for Trump's second term, we will be able to deport about half of those that came in only during Biden's term, not counting any other illegal immigrants that were already present in the United States. Um, and so, talking about questions like, demographic change in, I think in 2022, then there were more illegal immigrants entered the United States than children were born in the United States. Like it's a big deal, and I don't think that a lot of people recognize that. So being able to get these deportations carried out is a big deal for the long-term stability of the United States. Because frankly, if it doesn't happen this turn, it's probably not going to happen. And this is very much the window for it because there's no way that any kind of budget with this kind of allowance for immigration enforcement is going to happen after the midterms. There's no way that you're going to get anything through. So that is the major point. I would say I think that it's probably an unpleasant necessity. The debt is going up. That's not good. We should control it. But the harsh reality is that unless we severely curtail entitlement spending, then the deficit is not going anywhere, and no political party is willing to touch it because voters will punish anybody who does. So ultimately, the problem is not a problem with the big, beautiful bill. It's not a problem with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's simply a limitation that we're running to in the form of our government. Democracy will punish people who touch entitlement spending because voters like entitlement spending, even at the cost of blowing a hole in your budget the size of the Titanic. And so that's going to be a big problem for the United States going forward because that's just something that not even Trump with all his political power is able to deal with that. There's no way that he could realistically cut majorly Social Security spending. In fact, the bill does the opposite. It increases the standard deduction for older Americans. It decreases the amount of taxes that are being paid on Social Security funding. So it's actually going the opposite direction that you would want if you were actually serious about taming the budget. But that's just a reflection of basic political reality.
I think I'm a bit more fond of entitlements than you are, Joseph. I get the sense. And what I would say is the part of this bill that increases the debt is making the tax cuts permanent. Trump's tax cuts from his first term, which were supposed to be temporary, no one really thought that they were. And this bill makes those permanent. They do skew toward the rich and, corporate taxes. And that's what's basically blowing a hole in the budget. Trump used to be the big defender of entitlements. In 2016, it was a big reason why he along with his, foreign policy pronouncements, it was maybe the main reason why he was able to get the nomination and defeat the Bush dynasty, et cetera. As he said, he wasn't going to touch entitlements. He was a different kind of Republican. He wasn't the Paul Ryan type of Republican. I think the politics on this are terrible. You're because basically it's true what the liberals are saying that it decreases taxes on or perpetuates the existing tax cut for richer Americans and corporations and tries to sort of pay for that with Medicaid cuts. Really, it's more work requirements, but the effect will be the reason it actually cut costs is because a lot of people who are presently using Medicaid won't be able to use it anymore. It does the same thing with SNAP. Those used to be called food stamps. I will say I was wrong about something. I predicted on one of our episodes that in the Senate, when all these budget hawks were looking at the bill and they were saying, well, we have to find a way to cut spending given the amount of debt increase coming from the tax cuts. I thought that they were going to gut the immigration funding, and they didn't. as you mentioned, there's huge funding for immigration. I mean, there's going to be like more ICE agents than Marines if this thing gets passed by the House. It's kind of crazy. Another thing that I don't know if you mentioned, Joseph, some of this funding, this figure that you had earlier, goes to building the border wall. So Trump might actually succeed in, fulfilling that major key campaign promise from 2016. I agree with you that that's really good. It also increases spending for the military to have a golden dome, like a big version of Israel's Iron Dome. And, the reason they were able to pass this through reconciliation barely with a tie breaking vote from JD Vance was basically they had a bit of a budget gimmick where they said, because, reconciliation bills are not supposed to increase the debt. The actual point of the reconciliation process was to let Congress more easily pass like debt reducing bills, as I understand. But they basically said, well, these tax cuts already exist, even though they were considered temporary. That's basically the status quo. So we're not going to include the debt increase that follows from making those tax cuts permanent. And once you do that, the bill doesn't look like a fiscal disaster. It looks like a more fiscally neutral piece of legislation, but it's very misleading because that's a decrease in revenue relative to what it would have been if the tax cuts expired. And, this is all happening at a time where our debt to GDP level is worse than it's been since like World War II. And we're not at war. We shouldn't be having this problem right now. We've also seen some turmoil in the debt markets where it seems like people are a little less interested in buying our government bonds. And that's how the government pays for things that they don't have enough revenue for. They issue these IOUs basically. And America's historically been known as like the safest investment, getting these IOUs, these treasury bills and bonds. Um, that might not last forever in the age of multipolarity as people start to doubt that America is the safe haven it used to be. So that's concerning. I mean, Japan has hinted that they might dump large holdings of treasury bonds. It'd probably be kind of difficult for them to do so, but nevertheless, that suggestion has been made. We have all sorts of economic conflicts and trade conflicts with countries now, and this is a point of leverage that they have because if they dump their bonds, basically the U.S. government needs to raise interest rates in order to entice people to make them these IOUs more attractive. That increases the cost of servicing our debt. It also increases the cost of getting a mortgage, for example, because when they raise interest rate on these bonds, it has a direct impact on the interest rates that borrowers pay within the American domestic economy. We're not in this kind of doom loop yet where this could all spiral out of control, but I think now is a bad time to be messing with our physical situation, to be totally honest. But I don't know. Like, I think this bill maybe just had to be passed in order to fund Trump's policy agenda. But I do think that there's a big risk here. Sumantra, I don't know if you wanted to add anything beyond that.
No, I wanted to add like one thing to what Joseph mentioned. First of all, I mean this again. I am much more of a fiscal hawk. It's almost like an older class of Republican. I actually genuinely do care about the debt for the reasons that you mentioned. Like if the Treasury bonds are starting to get dropped, like people misunderstand the core nature of American power. It's not the military; it's the dollar supremacy. If that goes away, your sanctions powers goes away. Your entire authority crumbles. Maybe that's what's going to happen anyway, given multipolarity. But like that is not something which we should aspire for. The one thing which I wanted to add is, as you mentioned, Joseph, the amount of money that's being increased for ICE is essentially turning ICE to a domestic militia, which is fine. Immigration is important and that needs to be done. However, we are not seeing any corresponding cuts in the actual Pentagon military budget. If you are creating a whole seventh branch of the armed forces, essentially, which is going to operate within our hemisphere and within the region, the domestic theater, then we should at least nominally see some kind of balancing action from the external, militaristic forces which are there, which we are not seeing. There has been no cuts on the FBI budget. There has been no cuts in, the domestic production. It's apparently, our SecDef wants to bring it up to $1 trillion per year. If we are genuinely America first, as we claim to be, and if this administration and the next couple of administrations are the only chance we have to reorient the American foreign policy, one of the easiest things which we can do, which would also help budgeting, helping in our budgeting, would be to cut down on various different things. Off the top of my mind, exercises could be cut. We do so many different exercises with different countries in Europe and Asia. All of those things can go away. Exercises cost a lot of money. Basing could be cut. We don't need 800 military bases all around the world. That costs money. All of these things could go away, and there could be a massive. We are not seeing any kind of corresponding cuts when it comes to part of the reason why we are in so many different conflicts in throughout the world is essentially path dependency. Like we are there, that's why we are having to fight. If we are not there, we won't have to fight, which will save us some money. So there are ways to do that. I don't know. I mean, I'm not obviously an expert in this field, but I am an expert in military strategy, and this is one of the things that we can actually do to save money, which we are not seeing.
Yeah, you made a good point, Andrew, about the relationship between, sort of the new MAGA wing versus the old fiscal hawks, uh, about entitlements. I think that's perfectly fine. I tend to be much more on the fiscal hawk side myself. I think that entitlements are sociologically kind of bad. So in that aspect, I guess I'm more like Paul Ryan, God forbid. But I think that what you have to recognize is, if you're going to take politics seriously, and you want to be the high entitlement party, you also have to be the party of taxation. You can't simultaneously be the party of cutting taxes and entitlement spending. So one of the big issues that you have is Republicans still do not like taxes. They want to keep entitlement spending or even raise entitlement spending while cutting taxes. And the only way to do that is by blowing even bigger holes in the budget deficit. And that's just civilizationally short-sighted. It's a good way to end yourself in the position of Argentina. And you hope you don't end up with a Perón and 80 years later need a Malay to pull you out of the hole there.
Yeah, I think what bothers me about these entitlement cuts is Medicaid and SNAP are pretty much the only programs that working class people who are not old have access to. And, a lot of our entitlement fiscal problem is driven by Social Security and Medicare, right? But those are really sacrosanct. Like that's untouchable, and I can understand why. Like you want to make sure all the people are taken care of, but this is becoming really unbalanced in terms of who is served by America's welfare state, and it's about to get even more unbalanced. And Medicaid is something that a lot of Americans rely on at some point in their lives.
There is
It's
no
for low income,
AARP for the youth.
right? Um, So, but I think we need to move on. I had some other point that I wanted to say, but I've forgotten now. So let's go ahead and go to our picks of the week. Joseph, what's your pick of the week?
Yeah, I will go ahead and I will pick Jim Antle's piece on the Big Beautiful Bill. The title is The One Big Beautiful Realignment Artifact, and it talks a little bit about the fact that the ugly nature of the bill is part of the product of the transition between, the Paul Ryan GOP and the Trump GOP. So I think it's an interesting and insightful piece. Go read it.
And I'm going to pick a piece that I actually disagreed with somewhat, but it's on Iran, Trump's No Change Agent by the political scientist Joff Schifrinson. And he talks about how Trump, by striking Iran, basically aligned himself with the consensus foreign policy view, the kind of bipartisan, hawkish consensus view that he claimed to run against in 2016. The reason I slightly disagree with it is because I think any president, especially any Republican president, would have had immense pressure at this moment to go to war on Israel's behalf against Iran because, Iran's defenses are down, their proxy network is degraded, even their air defense systems have been degraded by Israel. That happened last year during this kind of exchange, especially in April and October between Israel and Iran. So I think Israel would have been pushing for this. I think another Republican president might have gone further and got us sucked into a longer war. And Trump, he just did a limited military mission and he got out. I think, but I do think that this problem may persist. We might end up getting into some kind of longer war. I'm expecting some sort of the ceasefire to break down basically between Israel and Iran. We've already seen some examples of that. So I'm picking this piece because I think it's good to keep the political pressure up on Trump and, remind people that he promised not to do this. He ran against Mideast wars, and I hope we see him, follow through on that promise better going forward. But that brings us to the end of this episode. I want to thank our listeners on podcast apps and remind them that you can watch a video version of this episode on YouTube. I want to thank people watching on YouTube. Please subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment, let us know what you think. And I want to thank you, Sumantra, and you, Joseph, for the illuminating discussion.